Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Kuhl, Erika Schiller, and Anna Stablem as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
The fourth annual Emissions Tracking, Reporting, and Compliance Conference is taking place this February 26th through the 27th at the Doubletree Greenway Plaza in Houston, Texas. This year's event will focus on the transformative role of artificial intelligence in emissions management and will explore innovative, data-driven strategies to enhance regulatory compliance and transparency within the energy sector. Attendees will have the opportunity to engage in interactive learning sessions, utilize AI-powered matchmaking tools for networking, and stay ahead of industry trends in emissions management. Join us in Houston as we spotlight AI's transformative potential in compliance emissions reporting, exploring innovative pathways to smarter, more efficient environmental management. Register and save 20% with our special promo code ClimbCo20. Hello, and welcome to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Erika Schiller. And today we are going to dive into carbon accounting. Wait, I know that might sound dull, but keep listening because I think you're going to learn something new and enjoy the conversation. I have with me Julie Mulkerin Ortiz. She is the General Manager of Decarbonization Strategy at Chevron, and she's here to tell us why we should be excited about carbon accounting.
Thanks for having me, Erika. I accept the challenge to make this as exciting as possible. I believe it's a game changer for competitiveness and helping us transition to a lower carbon future. In fact, when I talk to kids today, I tell them the superheroes of the future are carbon accountants, and they should dream of becoming one.
So why are we talking about carbon accounting? Why should we care?
For me, carbon accounting is just another way of saying that we need a comparable way to assess carbon competitiveness or performance. I think of it this way. We use standardized measures in our everyday lives, and we do this on a normalized basis to make easy comparisons. For example, when we eat something, we often think of calories per serving. When we get a job, we think of our pay per hour, maybe our salary per year. When we invest, we use earnings per share. When we think about health, we talk about body mass index. Having fluence in all these topics is something that we take for granted, but we use across our everyday lives to make decisions. And carbon's no different. We really need a standardized way to communicate carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions per product or service. We say carbon for short, but really you heard me just refer to greenhouse gas emissions because often those are expressed in their carbon dioxide equivalents to help people be able to compare the different greenhouse gases to one another. Absolute emissions and what a lot of companies report today are helpful of having an indication of the size of a company or the industry it may be in, but normalized emissions on a per unit of output is really the way that we can assess performance. Look, accounting wasn't my favorite topic in school, but the longer I've worked on this and in this space, I really began to appreciate the accounting as being the foundation for us to have comparisons and conversations about finances and have functioning financial markets. And accounting is really the missing piece here. My background is in commodities trading, buying and selling bulk products. And I often think if I were trying to decide who to buy from today or what to buy based on the information we have available now, I wouldn't be able to make a decision if I wanted to compare one supplier to another. There are many ways of doing things. And really the key is how do we provide decision useful information to know who's more competitive. Imagine trying to lose weight and you only know your yearly calorie intake, not per meal, not per snack, not for anything that you're eating. That's kind of where we are with carbon today. We want a low carbon diet, but don't know what's in what we consume. How can we go to the supermarket and buy what we want without knowing the information of what's in each food?
Okay, so you're using carbon as a proxy for environmental performance of a product, right?
Exactly.
And in simple terms, it can be compared to calories or financial performance. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It can help compare how much carbon is in each product or service. The challenge is today we don't have clear, consistent, comparable data.
I really like the calorie analogy. I think it's something we can all picture in our heads, that nutrition label on basically every product we buy at the grocery store. How did we get to those nutrition labels that are so ubiquitous today on all of our food?
It's funny you ask this because I've actually Googled this and how a lot of other standards are developed. Really looking for insights on how we can bring those same learnings to carbon accounting. A lot of the standards were developed when there was some failure or confusion in the marketplace. And with calories, it was no different. According to the internet, in the 1970s, there were a lot of claims being made about the nutritional benefits of different food products that companies were producing. And so that created confusion in the marketplace, and consumers didn't know which foods were actually healthier or not. So the government stepped in and helped develop the calorie reporting system that we know today. It's evolved over time, but that was really the start of the standardization. So really coming back to, whether it's been in financial markets or in calories, it was really to help avoid and help standardize what was a confusing place in the marketplace.
So in accounting, we have US GAAP, right? Those are the accounting rules you have to follow. In nutrition, we have those nutrition labels. And now we're talking about a carbon label on our products to say this is the environmental performance of it.
Yeah, that could be the future state. We're probably a little bit off from being able to do that. And so what we think about is how do we build the foundations of a program that could enable that at some point in the future.
So why haven't we figured out carbon labeling yet? I know there's a lot of reporting requirements for companies around greenhouse gas emissions. What's missing?
This is a question I get asked a lot. And a lot of people say, don't we already do some variety of this? And the answer is we do. Carbon reporting at the company level started on a voluntary basis about 25 years ago. It was created before regulations existed. About a decade later, some countries made it mandatory for facilities to report the emissions, but inconsistencies remain. Going back to our food examples, it's like if you were trying to bake a cake with one recipe and one's in grams and the other's in cups. You can use a conversion table to help you with that, but this would be like saying the recipe also tells you to bake the cake at different temperatures. That's confusing and inconsistent and might not give you the same results for your cake on the end. When you think about how commodity markets work, it's not facilities which report the emissions now that are crossing boundaries, it's products and services. So if everyone does it differently, how do you compare? How do you know who's more competitive?
So if I'm a business trying to buy a product, I might not even be comparing apples to apples. I might not be comparing numbers that are measured in the same way. How big of a range are we talking about when we talk about carbon estimates?
Yeah, if you're trying to use this now for decision making, good luck. You have some estimates around it that we really want to know as companies that we're competitive because we actually are performing better, not just because we calculated our emissions differently. Current carbon calculations, especially ones based on estimates, can dramatically vary. Just in terms of oil and gas production, it's estimated that in producing oil, there's more than a 10 times variation in just producing 1 barrel of oil. So think about in the market, if you're trying to use an average for that number, there's likely long tails of that distribution. So you might not know where the company you're buying from falls within that. If we take it back to calories, imagine you're going to eat a salad. If you have just lettuce, cucumbers, and some lemon juice, you'll have a totally different calorie profile than if you have a salad with lettuce, croutons, nuts, and seeds, and a ranch dressing. It's not that one's better than the other. It's not better or worse. There are trade-offs, pros and cons. You might need different elements and different nutrition in your diet, and you might be trying to balance for something different optimal levels on a different day. But that's all common knowledge when it comes to calories. Now we want to get to the same thing with carbon. So I actually have, continuing on this calorie example, a quick quiz for you if you're up for it.
All right.
Okay, picture your favorite chocolate bar. I know I love chocolate bars. Hopefully you do too.
Yes.
How many calories do you think there are in a standard chocolate bar?
I like a big dark chocolate candy bar. So I'm going to guess 500 calories.
Okay, that's you answered that pretty quickly. I also like dark chocolate. And that's right. It's about 300 to 500 calories, depending on if you want milk chocolate, dark chocolate, the size of the chocolate bar. And people can give us pretty specific information on how many calories are in a chocolate bar. Now, what if I were to ask you what the carbon footprint of a chocolate bar is? What's the range?
I definitely have no idea. I think of it more in comparables. Like I know red meat is really high, and I would think vegetables are really low, and I think chocolate's still pretty high, but I don't know anything more than that.
Right. And so when we were talking about calories before, you were able to give me a very precise number very quickly. You knew the units to put it in. And when I do this with large groups, I'm usually met with complete silence. And I'm mostly talking to people that study carbon emissions and think about this all day long. So
Wow.
if you're trying to manage a lower carbon diet, how can you do that without the information, even if the experts are kind of stuck when you ask a simple question like this?
So how do different industries compare when it comes to carbon accounting practices?
Historically, and I'm working in the oil and gas industry, and the reason that I've been able to work in this space for such a long time is that oil and gas industries and others that have a significant amount of emissions in one place have been covered by mandatory facility emissions reporting programs for usually around 10 to 15 years. Those industries are typically at the beginning of the supply chain. They're things like electricity generation, cement, steel, transport. And so you're really used to talking about carbon data from a primary data standpoint because we're reporting that information to a number of governments. A lot of the interest today comes from companies that are actually at the end of the value chain, those that directly interact with the final consumer and brands that many of us are familiar with. They've only recently been covered by mandatory disclosure regulations. And because they're at the end of the value chain, they rely on a lot of secondary data just from the nature of where they sit in the value chain. The opportunity that we see now is how do you bring that experience and interest together from across the value chain to collaborate to make advancements? And let's use the existing rules where they exist.
So what do we need to do to advance a carbon label on every product in the grocery store?
And there are three key items that we think if we solve them, we'll really be on our way to a solution. First is we need primary data, not estimates. Most current studies rely on broad assumptions that don't distinguish the more carbon competitive performers. Second, we need a consistent way to allocate emissions. If two companies do it differently, their carbon footprints can look dramatically different. And lastly, we need clear rules on carbon attributes. Right now, carbon can be double counted in supply chains.
So I think it'd be great if we drill down a little bit more, because I think each of those items you just brought up is really important. And especially even the first one, like if we don't have real data, how are companies going to be incentivized to do better, right? If they're worse than average, they say, oh, well, I'm better off because I'm average. And if a company is better than average, they say, oh, well, I'm worse off, but what can I do? Everyone's just using the average.
And that's precisely the point, is right now the incentives are actually aligned to reward the worst performers. Models that we have today are a great starting point to know what the emission sources are likely to be in a value chain so that you can make a roadmap on where to focus to getting primary data, because in those areas it could be a needle mover. A lot of the models now are trying to build out regional averages with the hope that it's somehow more accurate. However, so much has to do with individual operator choice that even within the same region, you can have very different carbon performance. Maybe I can use a quick example so that would help.
Great.
So if you think about an area that you're producing a product with predominantly coal-fired power plant, and you decide to do a power purchase agreement for lower carbon power, thus reducing the emissions associated with your product. A regional model wouldn't know about this commercial decision and wouldn't know how to reflect it in your assessment of carbon performance, and so you'd actually get penalized with a higher emissions profile. Now, imagine if we're trying to use averages, even regional ones, to do something like make investment decisions. Imagine using the average profitability for a sector and trying to decide an individual company stock to pick. Might be interesting information, but not super helpful because there's likely a large distribution of performance, just like there is in carbon.
Exactly. Yeah. So what's a simple example you can give us to help us think about this allocations issue?
So allocations really just refers to how you split the emissions between multiple products produced at a factory. If a factory produces just one item, it's pretty straightforward. You can take the emissions and divide by output, and you have a carbon performance or kind of carbon intensity on a per product basis. However, if a factory produces more than one thing, how you divide or allocate those emissions is really important. I'll use a quick example to make it more tangible. Imagine that you have a mine that produces 2 products of a very valuable gemstone and a bunch of rocks. In fact, it's 1% gemstones and 99% rocks. There are a few reasonable ways that you might decide to allocate or split those emissions, for example, based on weight or by value between the gemstones and rocks. You can see that even with just a simple example, if you choose a different approach, you can actually end up with inverse carbon performance data. So you can have 2 people, 2 reasonable people who are professionals in the space that choose a different way of doing the allocation and get totally different answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially what if the mine's only operating to produce those gemstones and the rocks are basically trash or a waste product that they're just kind of upgrading, right? Then should the rocks have any allocation at all?
Exactly. And then some people say, well, what if the rocks are waste at the beginning and someone pays to take them away, but then some later point in time, those rocks are sold and maybe they get turned into gravel for a garden or for a pathway, right? You can see that the complications that arise and those emissions may have already been allocated fully to the gemstone. So when you start, there's not necessarily one correct answer or one way of doing this. There are a few different reasonable answers, and really the important part is having a common approach so that we know how it's been done and that everything can be added together.
Yeah. So it's definitely a complex topic. But when we talk about environmental attributes, what are they? Can you help us with that definition?
Sure. So environmental attributes are new topics for some people, but really it's just a way of saying isolating and calculating the environmental performance or the carbon performance in this case with a product. Oftentimes when we're talking about better carbon performance, one of my friends described it to me once as you're trying to calculate the absence of an odorless, colorless gas, right? It's not like looking at a tangible asset like land or a gallon of gasoline, which we're familiar with and can see and tell us how much is there. And so what attributes are doing is really calculating that environmental performance associated with the product. It's particularly helpful to have in things where you have commingling in the value chain, for example, like in electricity. Back to this electricity example, when you're generating electricity, many times the electrons go into the common grid and they get delivered to all the different users like us at our houses. And by tracking the generation of different sources, you can see on paper where all of that, the weighted average of that entire grid, and you can even publish those numbers. You can also track who is contracted for and who's paying for each generation source. So if you have someone that wants to use renewable energy, but the electricity goes across the grid, by tracking the environmental attributes in its ownership, you're able to know that you're the only one allowed to claim the benefit and you're the one that's going to be using it in the production of your product, at least on paper. And that number can be backed out of the grid. So it's a common element in designing power markets, and it's like a fancy way of saying that you can count things once or count it in one place at one time.
And I think it also can show, look, if you contracted for that renewable energy and those environmental attributes, you value them, you're showing in the marketplace that those have value, that will theoretically drive more production of renewable energy, and kind of that virtuous cycle continues. But I think this goes back to your early example of why you need actual data when you're measuring the carbon footprint of a product.
Exactly. These are competitive marketplaces, and you don't want other electricity users to be able to claim the benefit that you took the time to procure, pay for, and that you're hoping your customers really value as well. But it's really just an accounting system issue. You can include the attributes as something to track and make sure that it's only counted one at each stage in the value chain to try and make sure that that's passed on in your value chain.
So when we think about carbon labels or the lack thereof, lack of clarity today, how has this led to real world consequences?
It's an issue coming up now. Some companies are accused of greenwashing or marketing their products as lower carbon when the accounting isn't standardized. Going back to how we got calories and financial reporting, some of that's the original impetus behind developing the standardized approach is because there's confusion in the marketplace. We've also seen businesses hesitant to invest in lower carbon solutions because they don't know how to measure return on investment accurately because of confusion around attributes and really how that's going to perform and produce a differentiated product for their customers.
So I think a common theme throughout this discussion has been businesses need incentives to make these decisions to invest in lower carbon products or make changes in their business. And so this theme of competitiveness running through our discussion, can you share more about why that's important?
Right now, emissions are measured commonly in two places, in the atmosphere or at the facility level. But of course, a company's financials are impacted when somebody buys their stocks or their products. Right now, those areas that don't fall within regulations and without transparency have the advantages we were talking about before. Those long tails of distribution aren't accounted for and everyone's kind of given the same number. We want carbon accounting to be consistent across both the company and the product level so we can incentivize competition on carbon performance. This has implications for global trade. Some countries are imposing carbon tariffs on imports. If companies don't standardize reporting, they could face trade barriers, even if their product is actually lower carbon. You just have no way of showing it and demonstrating it to the market. In fact, as a really interesting example of how much this topic has gained momentum over the last years, in last year's business input into the G20, one of the top themes was having consistent carbon footprints. Is a necessary solution to really help facilitate trade and facilitate performance assessments.
Wow. So it sounds like how you measure the carbon, the method, can make one company or one product look better or worse. Is that happening today?
It is. I'll give you a real life example of something we faced recently. One of the products we produce is liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Almost all LNG crosses national boundaries and is exported. Now, imagine that two companies own one LNG facility. This is really common in the oil and gas industry where you have a lot of co-ownership. One calculates emissions one way, another does it another way. It's the same gas, but gets two different carbon footprints. A buyer sees one as lower carbon, but is it really? We actually had a buyer call us and ask us about this exact issue. Two different companies, us being one of them, provided them gas or sold them gas, and we gave them different carbon footprints. This is a country where we had regulatory emissions reporting, but it doesn't specify how to do the allocations. So if you think about all the countries in the world that don't have any reporting requirements at the facility level, the variability could have been even wider. How does a buyer know which company to buy from? How does a company even report that on a normalized basis so that the marketplace knows who the better performer is?
Yeah, I mean, I see the confusion from a buyer, especially if they're buying it from the exact same plant. That's pretty wild. But, choosing a method that just makes you look better seems, one way and an easy out to make your product look lower carbon. But then this gas is a feedstock into other products. So how does this continue through the supply chain?
Well, this problem gets exacerbated throughout the supply chain. If a gas, for example, ends up being used for chemicals, the chemical plant needs to add its emissions to the product. Then say it transports it to the store, you want to add the transport emissions on and the store emissions. By the time it ends up on that shelf where you or I may see it, you're not really sure what that number represents. Say if that same issue presented at every stage in the value chain. Ideally, we should have a number that's meaningful and one that helps us actually assess the performance and competitiveness of the product. But right now, using the averages, estimates, models that have totally different ways of allocating emissions, it's hard to use the information to make a decision, let alone let you know if you should pay more or less for a product. But the good news is that, as I mentioned before with the input to the G20, people are starting to talk about this now. We have a lot of other examples and foundations upon which we can build.
So let's talk about those foundations. What do you mean that we have a foundation that we can build on to make this carbon accounting and carbon footprint a reality?
I think probably the strongest one that stands out to me is the system we have for financial accounting. Did you know that the first form of human writing was for accounting? I mean, talk about an exciting development. Literally thousands of years, people have been thinking about accounting, and hundreds of years ago, the T ledger for debits and credits was used for bookkeeping. So that concept really of the T ledger to record transactions, if you applied it to carbon, could be a really natural extension of an existing system that we have, where you could start with that for significant parts of the value chain. Some people talk about things like newer technologies like distributed ledgers or blockchain, which could be added in the future. But right now, the existing system we have for financial accounting has tools and systems that can be repurposed to help us start getting going now. I also like to think about it from a discipline's point of view. Before I was involved in this topic, and many of the people that I meet now who work on carbon reporting are from chemical engineering or sustainability backgrounds. But really for the robust approach, and even building upon the financial system, you need financial accountants, you need commercial negotiators, there's chemical engineers, lawyers, and technologists, and everyone to come together to build the solution. When I talk to students now, I don't know if it's the most popular suggestion I make, but I suggest that if they want to help really advance, then they should take some more accounting classes while they have the time to do it.
I wonder how many take you up on that. Can you share any success stories where companies have implemented carbon accounting practices?
Sure. I think if students knew the possibilities that this could deliver, everyone would be rushing to sign up. But there are some real examples where we've taken these type of experiences into how we develop methodologies. Back in 2021, we published a standard for LNG to really report the emissions throughout the value chain and a standardized approach to allocations. Now, many companies and countries are working together to try and standardize that. There are other examples around electricity, hydrogen, biofuels, and other products. And those are all great first movers. But really, when we think about how financial accounting developed, it was from this principles that hold together across sectors. And then you started developing where you needed additional guidance, more sector-specific guidance. If we started financial accounting from one product at a time and then applied different criteria for the same issue and then tried to add it up, it would be a lot more difficult than having this unified set of principles and then trying to develop more specific information where you need it. It just seems to be that it's a little bit easier to have that unification and really purpose of unification from the beginning versus trying to build it on at the end.
So are you seeing any emerging trends or innovations in carbon accounting that you find particularly promising?
There is so much happening right now. When we first started talking about this concretely a few years ago, there wasn't very much happening. I mean, think about it. Even the fact that we're having a podcast on this today is amazing. Whether you look at academic journals, technology landscape, industry groups and conversations, there's activity across all of these areas. There's now even an academic journal whose publication is dedicated to carbon accounting.
That's great. It'd be great to then move it to the next step and have it, incorporated into our business decisions and into our buying decisions as consumers. So what advice would you give to a company just starting its carbon accounting journey?
I would say think about it as really how you're going to assess where you're competitive and what you need to work on to be more competitive. It's really beyond the compliance of the reporting activity, but really to try and drive value. When you form your team, it's really easy in business to say, oh, this belongs in this one function or this one area. But really on this topic, it's been really helpful to have people from different disciplines, as I was mentioning before, commercial finance, accounting, environmental law, technology, because you're really trying to create a foundation and a system that can be durable over time.
And I think without the, very clear consistency across industries and how companies operate, transparency is really important. I know at ClimeCo, we talk to a lot of our customers about these gray areas and how just being as transparent as you can is really important to establish trust and, in these developing marketplaces. But some people say carbon accounting is too complicated and that companies should just focus on reducing emissions. What do you think about that?
Eventually we want to get to the point and we want to incentivize emission reductions as soon as possible. But that's like saying a business should focus on making money and not track revenue or expenses. How do you know what's profitable without those components? And you need to do the same things to incentivize reductions and better performance.
Yeah, great response. And what about skepticism from stakeholders who don't see the value in carbon accounting, which I know can be common across a very large enterprise?
Look, not everyone's going to care and they don't have to. What this allows you to do is help segment the market and really level the playing field to protect and incentivize competitiveness. Not everyone has to choose the same option. And really the standardization around carbon accounting can help. And if all different businesses from across different sectors contribute their solutions and see how they stack up against one another.
Yeah, I see it as an important tool for empowering buyers, right? It could be buyers as large companies or it could be buyers as individual consumers, just giving them more information. Let's talk about the future. What do you look for? What are you looking forward to?
This is a journey. It's taking a little bit longer than I would have expected. But, I think in the future, we may see things like carbon accounting degrees in university programs. I hope that in my career, we'll see the day when we have standardized way of doing carbon accounting. Then we can compare things on a life cycle basis and start to use it in decision-making and optimizing pathways to improve carbon competitiveness, just like we do with profitability.
Yeah, and then also, drive better environmental outcomes, right? And that's what motivates me in all of this. Before we go, if there's one takeaway that you want our listeners to remember, what would it be?
Someday I want us to be as fluent in carbon as we are in calories. The sooner we standardize accounting, the sooner we can include it in our decision-making, and the sooner we can compete.
That's great. And don't forget to sign up for your next carbon accounting class, right?
Exactly. Yes. Take some carbon accounting classes.
Yes. Julie, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our listeners for sticking with us through this complex topic of carbon accounting. We hope that next time you buy a chocolate bar, you'll also think about the carbon footprint of that product or how little you know about it.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting climbco.com.